Welcome to the Sports Science Solutions Hockey Biomechanics presentation. One of the main questions we always get asked is, what exactly do we do? The simplest way to answer that question is, we're sort of the biomechanics version of Moneyball. What I mean by that is we're measuring force along the three planes of motion. And when we look at biomechanics, biomechanics is a combination of two different sciences, physics and kinesiology. Physics being the study of the laws of the world that we live in, kinesiology being the study of the human body and how it moves. So biomechanics is really the study of how physics and the human body interact with one another. What's unique about what we do is we are actually able to measure the forces of the body moving along the three planes of motion, which allows us to understand force and not just movement. So we're able to get both sides of the equation to understand a full biomechanical picture. So this means that we assessed how things happen and why things happen. We're not necessarily concerned as much with what's happening. We want to understand how and why things happen more importantly. So the data set and the population we've worked with so far on this study. We've got 279 players assessed. They range anywhere from youth to NHL players, and their ranges from 8 to 35 years old. Some relevant data to go over. First is stride stability. This is the measurement of the sagittal pattern of the pelvis. So the practical applications of stride stability are that it's an injury predictor, it's a force potential predictor, and it's a measure of efficiency. So when we're looking at the stability of the stride, if the pelvis is not stable in the sagittal plane, and there's a lot of anterior and posterior pelvic tilt, this is going to disable the hip joint from proper movement patterns. This is why it becomes a predictor for injury. The body's built in a stable and mobile pattern of joints. If that chain is disrupted for any reason, the next stage of that chain is going to try to compensate. So if the hip is immobilized because the pelvis is out of position or moving too much in the sagittal plane, we're going to struggle to see quality movement from that hip joint. That becomes residual issues with the soft tissues around the hip and the groin area. Specifically with hockey players, we see a lot of lower back issues and a lot of hip flexor issues and groin issues as a result of unstable sagittal pelvis position. So the stride stability is a big important factor. It's also a force predictor because a stable sagittal pelvis allows for frontal plane movement, which is the #1 predictor of force. So the efficiency of the stride is also heavily tied to the sagittal movement. If the sagittal movement is stable, there's a much higher probability for efficient movement. When we're looking at starting force, it's another important data metric we look at. We're looking at the direction and the magnitude of the force that's being created by the pelvis through the skating stride. So the practical applications of this are assessing first step speed. So we want to understand what makes a player fast or why certain players are faster than others with that first step speed. The starting force is the measurement that we would look at to see that. Overall top speed prediction is also a big part of starting force, because if you're starting with a higher force, you're going to be able to reach higher levels of speed over smaller periods of time. In hockey, that plays out more realistically in the game. Also a measure of efficiency with starting force. If we have high levels of starting force, typically the structure, because of its power, is also a measure of efficiency. Other relevant data, ice reaction force. So we're looking at the frontal plane force and the magnitude. So basically how much energy the player is putting into the ice and thus getting back out of the ice as a reactionary force. Practical applications. This is the highest predictor for explosive speed. So when we see high ice reaction force in players' measurements, we know that they have good quality movement that is going to result in high levels of output of energy. So the force potential predictor comes back to ice reaction force. Again, a measure of efficiency. If we're creating a lot of force in the frontal plane, we know that we have an efficient and stable movement pattern. Stride analysis is the direction and magnitude of movement. The practical application of measuring and doing stride analysis is we get to see things like stride efficiency. So when we see a stride that lacks efficiency, what we know are things like that player's not going to be able to go hard for a 45-second shift. They're going to need to take, time off during that shift. A lot of times when we see players not moving their feet and resting, it actually comes back and correlates heavily to their stride efficiency. If they don't have stride efficiency, they can't keep their feet moving for 45 seconds and still have strength. And so therefore what they're going to do is they're going to take breaks. They're going to stop moving their feet. And again, the other side of that coin is if we can teach stride efficiency, we can keep a player on the ice longer, expending more energy, but getting the same levels of force and production from that player. Stride recovery is a big part of stride analysis. We're able to see how fast a player is able to recover from the stride after it's been made. This speaks highly to sagittal pelvis stability, and also is an important measure in terms of giving us an idea for a player's cadence with their stride. We're also able to measure stride length. We're able to see which direction of force a player is striding, how much energy they're putting outward versus backward versus downward. So again, that ability to measure 3 dimensions of force allows us to understand stride length in a much more dynamic way, not just a one-dimensional type of force. We're able to understand exactly how a player is applying force into the ice. So the case study we're going to look at to understand a little bit more about what we're talking about here is a 2013 by the name of Michael Mufara. He's a defenseman who's a member of the Chicago Brick team. In 2021 and 22, Michael was playing Double-A mites with 2013's his own age. He played 53 games, 128 goals, 48 assists for 176 points. In 2022 and 23, he stepped up and played with kids older than him. He played Double-A against 2012s, played 55 games, 46 goals, 71 assists for 117 points. This current year, he's playing Triple-A 2013, so back to playing kids his own age, but stepped up to Triple-A's. In 41 games, he has 51 goals and 73 assists for 124 points. This is Michael going bar down from the point. This was when he was 8 years old, and you can see with this shot, his mechanics and his biomechanics are phenomenal. So his shot is a big reason why Michael was such a high-level player and such a high-level scorer. But as we're going to see with this case study, there were some holes in Michael's game. So through this case study, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at Michael's initial assessment. We're going to talk about the level 1 intervention that was done. We're going to talk about the level 2 applications of those interventions, and then we're going to look back at some performance and see how those the interventions and the assessment played out ultimately into Michael's game. So this is a highlight we're going to break down through Michael here. So high level play, lots of skill. We're going to break down exactly what we see in that video. So some things to notice about Michael's assessment. First is the frontal plane score. So if you look at the top of the assessment here, you'll see the overall score, and below that, the sagittal, frontal, and transverse plane scores. So those are the scores that are specific to the measurements we took for that athlete in those planes of motion. Now, Michael's frontal plane score is clearly lower than his sagittal and transverse plane scores. So that's something that we're going to take note of immediately. If you drop down under the stability section, we're going to see that Michael's transition stability was scored out as a 0. He had 22.3 degrees of anterior and posterior pelvic tilt while he was transitioning from forward to backwards, which shows a huge dysfunction and imbalance in his frontal plane. Further, when we look down, his crossover instabilities were not very good. He had excessive crossover stabilities to the right and left, and we start to see that there is a left and right imbalance for Michael. And when Michael stands on his right leg, specifically in the frontal plane, he lacks stability and therefore is going to have a lot of different issues. So the one big thing that we took from all of this data from Michael's initial assessment was that these are all frontal plane issues. So the goal of the level 1 intervention for Michael was to develop the frontal plane movement. This meant getting his pelvis and ribcage moving with each other properly in the frontal plane. Secondary goal was to acquire the muscle engagement that went along with these movements of the ribcage and pelvis. In this exercise to address Michael's frontal plane, we created 2 guides on a system with biofeedback. You can see them here and here on the screen. When Michael moves his pelvis in the frontal plane, that red ball on the screen will move into one of those two guides. So as Michael looks to load his pelvis, that ball moves into those guides. As he lands, he learns how to put the pelvis in a position to load the other guide. So as he moves back and forth, Michael's starting to learn how to position his body in real time, and very exactly. We've put these guides in a specific spot that is going to allow Michael to put the pelvis in such a position to learn how to engage his core while he is using the frontal plane. So you can see Michael is not the greatest with this to start because these are new activities for Michael. So Michael is both unstable as he's moving side to side. You can see him kind of trying to catch his balance as he goes side to side here. So this is Michael in a stage 1 intervention activity where he's just starting to learn and train his body and his brain how to engage muscles in the frontal plane. We use the biofeedback system so that he can build more precision with his movement and develop a faster understanding of what it means to move certain body parts in certain planes of motion. In a more advanced level 1 integration activity for Michael, what we see here is we start to integrate these lateral explosions where he's loading the frontal plane on one side, exploding into the other leg, and immediately using that energy and redirecting to jump up onto the bucket. So Michael is loading the frontal plane. He's going to create that explosiveness laterally, transfer that energy from the lateral shift into a vertical thrust. And this is going to be a movement that helps Michael use the frontal plane to effectively explode on the ice, moving off of one side and exploding up and into the other. The goal of the level 2 application is to transfer the movements learned in level 1 of the rib cage and pelvis and maintain the muscle engagement that went along with those movements. Here we see Michael beginning to do a level 2 activity where he's going to begin integrating a lot of the skills of the frontal plane into a hockey-like movement. So we've destabilized his base by putting him on this slide board with the boots on, and so he's going to have to use a lot of that frontal plane to create explosion, but he's got to also start to learn how to use his core to create some stability. Now you can see here as Michael's starting to do this, he likes to use his arms to create stability as he's coming across. And this is because we were early on in the process of doing level 2 integration. So his core still wasn't doing everything it could in terms of creating stability for him. But this is a good first step that you see Michael starting to take the movement that was once unfamiliar to him and now is integrating it into a hockey-specific activity. And again, we see Michael in a level 2 activity here integrating. We're seeing the lateral movement. So as Michael's beginning to work on the ice here, we're noticing a couple of things. He is doing a good job creating frontal plane movement, although his explosion is still not quite where it needs to be. You can see his skates moving backwards as opposed to more down and out. So again, this is an example of an early drill of Michael learning how to use and integrate that frontal plane onto the ice. As he's creating side-to-side explosiveness using specific control of his abs. Again, when we watch this, we want to watch the stability of the stick, right? You can tell this is early on in Michael's development because the stick is still moving around a lot, which is telling us that Michael's using his arms to create balance. As Michael got better at this, he was able to do this drill without moving his arms nearly as much. And that's because the muscles that connected his rib cage and his pelvis were more active, and that the frontal plane movement that he was using from the pelvis was not going to affect his arms or his legs as much, which left them for more hockey-like activities like stick handling and shooting. Okay, level 3, we are looking for the demonstration of mastery of skill. What this means is that we want to see that a player's move from level 1, which is really about discovery, where a player is learning how to do something for the first time, to level 2, where they're able to demonstrate a familiarity with the movement and being able to integrate it into specific movement concepts. And level 3, when we get to mastery, what we're really looking at is an ability for a player to use reactive performance, which means they're not having to think their way through the process. They're actually able to allow their bodies to react appropriately. All right, so we're going to break down this play and we're going to look at some of the subtleties of what Michael does here that makes him so effective at beating the defense.
So as Michael rushes up the ice, and he's looking up, he makes a quick move here. He's going to drag, split the D, and then he's going to finish up top. Okay, so what's important as we're looking at this goal, a couple of important things happen that Michael has been trained how to do. Okay, by taking the puck wide, Michael is going to allow himself to create an opportunity to move back to the middle. Okay, as he moves to his right leg here, he's going to create a quick explosion from the right to the left. So in this position, Michael has gotten his right hip to move up. This has activated the right posterior chain. His hamstring is glued in his right leg, as well as the right oblique. So this is going to allow Michael to create a quick movement from his right over to his left. As the shift occurs back into the left, this is the key movement. So the movement from right to left has allowed Michael now to load dynamically into this left side. So as he pulls the puck back to the left here, his left leg has actually been loaded very dynamically from the push that he got from loading the right side previously. Okay, so again, the load here and the explosion into the left leg in the frontal plane gives Michael now the ability to push off that side. The extension of that left leg now is giving Michael the thrust that came from the frontal plane shift from the right side to the left. After he explodes off the left leg, you see the burst of speed that pushes Michael beyond the defenseman. So that burst of speed off of his left leg that was so subtle actually came from the loading pattern from right to left. So Michael, over the training, has learned that loading right, exploding left gives him the ability to then very subtly explode back to the middle of the ice, creating a burst of speed that catches defenders by surprise. Now, not only did Michael create that burst of speed, he takes contact from both players, right, is able to maintain control of the puck and his stride. So notice that Michael has not actually broken stride here. He's on his right leg as he takes contact. So he's standing on one leg. Again, that right hip coming up gives him the right posterior chain engagement as well as the engagement in his abs that is going to give him the stability to actually move through that hit. So he gets back off of that left leg and strides. By the time he gets back off of that, he's able to catch his balance on that left leg. So as his lower body is stabilizing, the pelvis has remained stable the entire time. So his extremities, his arms and his legs are able to take contact while his core remains very stable. This allows him to move through contact, recover immediately. So you can see Michael's left hand isn't even on his stick until he reaches this point here. He gets a very quick grip on the stick right there and is already in position to fire the puck. So because he never lost sagittal control of the pelvis, he was able to use the pelvis in the frontal plane. The corresponding muscle engagement that he got from that engagement from the frontal plane allowed him to create this movement. And on the backside of this movement, that core stability allowed him to recover his appendages quickly. So all of the proximal stability that he had allowed him to then exhibit this distal control of his extremities. Now his arms and his legs immediately recover and are able to release a quick shot that comes from his left oblique, right, with the stability of the lower body. And is able to beat the goalie cleanly. So these are all things that are trained. These are not accidents. These are things that Michael works on intently. The frontal plane action is only opened when the sagittal plane of the pelvis is stable. So training the stable sagittal plane of the pelvis allows you to then move on to step 2, which is training the frontal plane movement of the pelvis. The frontal plane movement of the pelvis is what's responsible for this entire play occurring. And again, as we watch Michael here, the subtlety of these movements as he makes these quick shifts can't be lost.
So some things that we didn't talk about throughout this. Number one is the ability to analyze shooting the same way that we analyzed the skating structure of Michael. Number two is passing. We can also look at stick handling structures. We can look at puck control situations in one-on-one, two-on-two battles, things like that. And the last one, a big one, is goaltending. A lot of the injuries that we see through goalies and soft tissue injuries that we see are directly related, again, to the proximal movements of the pelvis and the rib cage. Some future applications and things that we're looking to do is to move from proximal to distal. So again, looking at specifically the pelvis and the rib cage, and what we've been able to glean from that has been great, but being able to start to move out from there and start to look more at the extremities, understand more about the movements and the forces of the extremities beyond just the analysis of the pelvis and the rib cage. That's really what we're able to start to look into, and those hopefully are the next steps for us.